The scream that shattered the pre-dawn silence around the Vaughn homestead wasn't the cry of a newborn child. It was Cordelia Whitman and the most seasoned midwife in 3 counties shrieking in absolute terror at what she had just pulled from Emmeline Vaughn's womb. For 37 years, Cordelia had delivered babies of every conceivable size and condition breach, births, twins, even one set of triplets during a blizzard that nearly killed them all. But nothing in her vast experience had prepared her for the weight that sent her stumbling backward across the rough-hewn cabin floor, her arms trembling with the effort of supporting what defied every natural law she understood about human birth. Sheriff Silas McKinley, summoned by Clayton Vaughn's frantic midnight ride, stood frozen in the doorway, like a man witnessing the impossible unfold before his eyes. At 45, he had seen men torn apart by grizzly bears, witnessed the aftermath of the bloodiest saloon fights, and investigated deaths that would haunt lesser men's dreams. Yet nothing had prepared him for this moment, watching Cordelia cradle an infant whose size challenged everything he thought he knew about the limits of human nature. The baby in her arms was breathing, crying, with a voice deeper and stronger than any newborn's wail, and very much alive. But what unsettled every person in that cramped cabin wasn't just his extraordinary dimensions or the way he seemed to focus on each face, with eyes that appeared far too knowing for someone who had just entered the world. It was the dawning realization that if such a birth was possible, then everything they believed about human limitations might be completely wrong. 3 hours before dawn, Cordelia had been jolted awake by desperate pounding on her cabin door. Clayton Vaughn stood there in the darkness, his weathered face pale with panic, stammering that Emmeline's time had come, and something felt different, terrifyingly different this time around. Cordelia had delivered hundreds of babies throughout the territory, including Clayton and Emmeline's first 3 children, each birth progressively more challenging due to the mother's unusual stature and strength. But she had never seen the typically composed rancher so visibly shake in his hands, trembling, as he helped her load her supplies into his wagon. As they rode through the crisp October air toward the Vaughn homestead, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth, Clayton kept glancing at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. It was as if he wanted to confess something, but couldn't find the words. The moonlight cast long shadows across the rolling prairie, and in the distance, coyotes howled their ancient songs to the star-filled sky. Mrs. Whitman. Clayton finally spoke, his voice barely audible above the wagon wheels. Emmeline's been having dreams. Strange dreams about this baby. She says she can feel him moving inside her with a strength that frightens her, and she's never been frightened by anything in her life. Cordelia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She had delivered Emmeline's other children healthy babies, each weighing nearly 10 pounds, which she had attributed to their mother's exceptional size and robust constitution. But Clayton's words carried an undercurrent of fear that made her grip the wagon seat tighter. When they arrived at the homestead, Cordelia immediately understood Clayton's unease. Even from outside the cabin, she could hear Emmeline's labor cries echoing across the valley. But these weren't the typical sounds of a woman in childbirth. These were deeper, more primal, like the roars of a lioness defending her cubs against a pack of wolves. Stepping inside, Cordelia was struck by the sight of Emmeline Vaughn in the throes of labor. All 6 feet and 7 inches of her towered, even while lying down, her massive frame making the sturdy bed look like children's furniture. Her arms developed from years of hauling water barrels, chopping cordwood, and lifting feed sacks that most men struggled with, strained against the wooden bed frame as another contraction seized her. Muscles rippled beneath her sweat-dampened skin like steel cables under tension. Mrs. Whitman. Emmeline gasped between contractions, her voice carrying an edge of vulnerability that Cordelia had never heard from the usually unshakable woman. Something's wrong. This baby feels too large even for me. I can feel his strength, and it's not natural. Cordelia had assisted at countless births throughout the territory. But looking at Emmeline now, seeing the way her enormous belly seemed to stretch beyond anything she had witnessed in nearly 4 decades of midwifery, she felt genuine fear creep up her spine. As she began her examination, Cordelia's experienced hands immediately detected something that made her breath catch in her throat. The baby was positioned correctly for delivery, but his size was unlike anything she had encountered. Her fingers traced the outline through Emmeline's stretched skin, and she had to steady herself against the bed to keep from falling. This baby felt massive, far larger than any infant should be. Yet his heartbeat was strong and steady, echoing through her listening horn with the rhythm of perfect health. "Clayton," she called out, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Ride to town and fetch Sheriff McKinley. Tell him to bring Doc Briggs if he can locate him. And Clayton," she paused, meeting his worried eyes, "tell them to come quickly, but tell no one else what's happening here. Not yet." She wasn't entirely sure why she was requesting the sheriff's presence, but some deep instinct told her that what was about to unfold would require witnesses that people would trust and respect. As Clayton hurried out into the pre-dawn darkness, his boots echoing across the wooden porch, Cordelia turned back to Emmeline, whose massive form was now causing the entire bed to shake with each contraction. But what Cordelia couldn't have predicted was that in less than 2 hours, she would be holding something in her trembling arms that would make her question everything she thought she understood about the nature of human birth, and set in motion events that would threaten not just the Vaughn family's peace, but their very freedom. Sheriff Silas McKinley arrived just as the first pale rays of sunlight began filtering through the cabin's small windows, Doc Briggs trailing behind him with his worn leather medical bag clutched in his weathered hands. Both men had to duck slightly to enter the modest dwelling, but their considerable height paled in comparison to Emmeline Vaughn, who, even lying in bed, seemed to dominate the entire room with her presence. McKinley had known Emmeline since she was a gangly 12-year-old girl, already taller than most grown women. He had watched her develop her extraordinary strength, had seen her lift fallen tree branches off trapped cattle with her bare hands, had witnessed her subdue a rampaging bull that had terrorized 3 neighboring ranches. But he had never seen her look so vulnerable, so genuinely afraid. "What's the emergency, Cordelia?" Doc Briggs asked, setting down his bag and immediately moving toward the bed. At 50, he was the most educated man in the territory, having studied medicine in Boston before seeking his fortune in the Western Territories. But before Cordelia could answer, another contraction seized Emmeline with such force that both men instinctively stepped backward. The sound that emerged from her throat made the cabin's windows rattle in their frames. It wasn't just pain they heard, but something closer to a primal battle cry, as if she were wrestling with a force of nature itself. The wooden bed frame groaned ominously under the pressure of her massive hands gripping the headboard, and hairline cracks appeared in the sturdy oak where her fingers pressed. Cordelia wiped perspiration from her forehead with the back of her hand and looked at the 2 men with an expression they had never seen on her usually confident face. Genuine uncertainty mixed with barely controlled fear. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I've delivered over 800 babies in my career. I've handled breech births, twins, even triplets during that terrible blizzard 5 years past. But this," she gestured toward Emmeline's enormous belly, which seemed to pulse and shift with movements that appeared far too powerful for any unborn child. "This baby is going to challenge everything we think we know about what's possible." Doc Briggs stepped forward and placed his experienced hands on Emmeline's abdomen, his fingers immediately detecting what had shaken Cordelia so profoundly. His eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed spectacles as he felt the size and apparent weight of the child within. The baby's limbs were clearly defined through the stretched skin, and when he moved, the force was enough to visibly distort his mother's belly. "Dear Lord in heaven," Briggs whispered more to himself than to the others. How is this even medically possible? He had studied obstetrics under some of Boston's finest physicians, had read every textbook he could acquire on unusual births, but nothing had prepared him for what his hands were telling him. This infant felt fully developed, robust, and impossibly large for someone yet to be born. Emmeline's voice cut through their whispered concerns, strong, despite her obvious exhaustion and growing fear. "Stop discussing me like I'm not here. I've carried this child for 9 months, felt him grow stronger every day. My body was made for this challenge, whatever it brings." Even as she spoke with characteristic defiance, another contraction gripped her, and this time the force of it caused the entire cabin to tremble on its foundation. Her powerful arms muscles, clearly defined, even in her current state of exhaustion, strained against the bed frame with such tremendous pressure that the wood began to splinter under her grip. Sheriff McKinley found himself staring at the scene with growing fascination and alarm. He had been summoned to witness unusual events, before disputed property lines, accusations of cattle rustling, even one memorable incident involving a man who claimed he could commune with spirits. But this felt fundamentally different, more significant somehow, as if whatever was about to happen would change something essential about their understanding of what was possible in their ordered world. The baby's movements were so pronounced that even from across the room, McKinley could see the dramatic shifts in Emmeline's massive belly, movements that seemed far too coordinated and purposeful for an unborn child, as if the infant were actively participating in his own birth rather than simply being delivered. "It's time," Emmeline announced suddenly, her voice carrying absolute certainty despite the fear flickering in her dark eyes. "He's coming now. I can feel him positioning himself." Cordelia quickly positioned herself at the foot of the bed, her hands steady despite her racing heart, while Doc Briggs prepared his instruments with the methodical precision of long practice. Sheriff McKinley remained near the door, but found himself unable to look away from what was about to unfold. Sensing that he was about to witness something that would be discussed and debated for decades to come. None of them were prepared for the moment when Cordelia would reach forward to guide the baby into the world, only to discover that she would need every ounce of her own considerable strength just to support what was emerging, and that the true challenges would begin not with the birth itself, but with what happened when word of this extraordinary child spread beyond their small community. The moment Cordelia's hands made contact with the baby's head, she knew her 37 years of experience had been merely preparation for this single, impossible moment. The crown alone felt massive under her fingers, easily twice the size of any newborn she had ever guided into the world. The skull was perfectly formed but enormous, suggesting a brain capacity that defied medical understanding. Emmeline bore down with a strength that caused the entire cabin to shudder, channeling every ounce of her extraordinary physicality into bringing her child to life. The wooden bed frame creaked ominously under the force of her grip, and rivulets of sweat rolled down her face as she pushed with the determination of a woman who had never backed down from any challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed. "I can see his head," Cordelia announced, though her voice carried a tremor she couldn't suppress. What she saw defied every medical textbook she had ever studied. The baby's head was enormous, perfectly shaped, but easily twice the size of any infant she had delivered in nearly 4 decades of practice. The skull plates were properly formed, the facial features clearly visible and beautifully proportioned, but the scale was beyond anything in her experience. Doc Briggs stepped closer, his medical training warring with the impossibility of what his eyes were showing him. He had studied cases of unusual births in his medical journals, had read accounts of large babies born to exceptional mothers, but this transcended anything documented in medical literature. Sheriff McKinley found himself holding his breath, sensing that he was witnessing something that would be discussed in hushed tones around campfires and dinner tables for generations. The very air in the cabin seemed charged with significance, as if nature itself were holding its breath to see what would emerge. With the next tremendous contraction, the shoulders emerged, and Cordelia had to brace her feet against the floor to maintain her balance. The baby's shoulders were broad and well-developed, suggesting a level of physical maturity that seemed impossible for a newborn. His chest was expanding and contracting with the rhythm of established breathing even before he was fully delivered. Emmeline let out a roar of effort that rattled every piece of crockery in the cabin, her massive arms bulging with muscle as she channeled every fiber of her strength into this final monumental push. The sight of this towering woman giving birth was already extraordinary. But what emerged from her body transcended anything any of them had imagined possible. Then, with one final tremendous effort that seemed to draw on reserves of strength that went beyond the merely physical, the baby slipped free completely. Cordelia's scream of shock echoed through the cabin and out into the morning air, carrying across the valley like the cry of a woman who had just witnessed a miracle that challenged the very foundations of her understanding. The infant in her arms was colossal. He stretched from her elbow to her fingertips, with a robust, well-formed body that looked more like a 3-month-old child than a newborn. She estimated his weight at 22 pounds more than double what even the largest typical newborn would weigh. His limbs were proportionally thick and strong, his chest broad and deep, and his head perfectly shaped, but enormous in its proportions. Sweet, merciful heaven, Doc Briggs whispered, stepping forward with hands that trembled despite his decades of medical practice. The baby was crying with a voice that was deeper and stronger than any newborn's wail he had ever heard. A sound that filled the cabin with surprising volume and seemed to carry an almost adult quality of communication. Sheriff McKinley stood transfixed, his mouth agape, trying to process what his eyes were telling him. This wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Yet here was the evidence, crying lustily in Cordelia's trembling arms, his large eyes already focusing on the faces around him with an alertness that seemed far beyond his chronological age. Emmeline, exhausted but alert, raised her head to see her son for the first time. Even she, despite carrying him for 9 months and feeling his extraordinary size and strength throughout her pregnancy, gasped when she finally laid eyes on him. He was beautiful, perfectly formed, but gigantic, with the robust health of a child who had been growing far longer than the typical 9 months. "Clayton," she called weakly to her husband, who stood pale and speechless in the corner, overwhelmed by what he had just witnessed. "Come meet your son." But as Doc Briggs reached for his portable scale to weigh the infant, and as the first whispers of this extraordinary birth began to spread beyond the cabin walls, through the network of ranchers and townspeople who had noticed the unusual commotion, none of them realized that this moment would mark the beginning of events that would test their community's character, challenge their understanding of family loyalty, and ultimately force them to choose between protecting one remarkable child and succumbing to pressures from forces far more dangerous than they could imagine. The baby's cries seemed to announce not just his arrival into the world, but the beginning of a struggle that would determine whether extraordinary gifts were meant to be celebrated and protected or exploited and controlled. Doc Briggs placed the baby on his portable scale with hands that shook despite his decades of medical practice. The needle swung past every measurement he had expected, sweeping through 10 pounds, 15 pounds, and finally settling with definitive precision at 22 pounds and 4 ounces. He stared at the reading in disbelief, carefully removed the infant, checked the scale's accuracy with his medical bag and several instruments, and then weighed the baby again with meticulous attention to detail. The result remained unchanged: 22 pounds, 4 ounces. In 43 years of practicing medicine, from the sophisticated hospitals of Boston to the rough frontier settlements of the Western Territories, he had never encountered a newborn exceeding 12 pounds. Even those cases had typically resulted in difficult deliveries requiring surgical intervention, extended labor, or other serious complications. Yet here was Emmeline Vaughn, sitting up in bed, looking tired but remarkably well, having delivered this giant child through what appeared to be a completely natural birth process. Sheriff McKinley approached the scale slowly, as if walking towards something that might fundamentally alter his understanding of reality. He had investigated seemingly impossible claims throughout his career, had arrested men who boasted of supernatural strength, had encountered liars and fraudsters, attempting every conceivable deception, to gain attention or money. But there was no trickery here. No explanation that fit within his established understanding of how the world operated. The baby was undeniably real, obviously healthy, and impossibly large. More unsettling still was the way the infant seemed to track movement and focus on faces with an intensity that suggested awareness far beyond typical newborn behavior. Doc McKinley said quietly, removing his hat and running weathered fingers through his graying hair. How do we explain this to people who in their right mind is going to believe what we've witnessed here? Clayton Vaughn finally moved from his frozen position against the cabin wall, approaching his son with the careful steps of a man walking on ground that might give way beneath him at any moment. When Cordelia gently placed the baby in his arms, he nearly buckled under the unexpected weight. The infant felt solid and substantial, like holding a sack of grain. Yet he was warm, breathing normally, and looking up at his father with bright, alert eyes that seemed to contain depths of intelligence. "He's beautiful," Clayton whispered, though his voice carried profound bewilderment. "Emmeline, how did we create something so—" He trailed off, unable to find words adequate for what he was experiencing. Emmeline reached out with arms that still trembled from the tremendous exertion of birth, and when Clayton placed their son against her chest, she marveled at how substantial he felt. Her other 3 children had been large babies, each weighing nearly 10 pounds, which she had attributed to her own exceptional size and robust constitution. But this child felt fundamentally different, not just larger, but somehow more present, more solid than seemed possible for someone who had just entered the world. "We'll call him Magnus." She decided, the name seeming to fit his extraordinary nature perfectly. Magnus Vaughn. He'll need a strong name to match his strength. But even as the family began to bond with their remarkable new member, word of the extraordinary birth was already spreading with the speed that only truly shocking news could achieve in a tight-knit frontier community. Mrs. Hollister, who lived in the nearest cabin about a quarter-mile down the valley, had heard Cordelia's scream of shock echoing across the morning air. She had also witnessed Clayton's frantic midnight ride to fetch help, and her curiosity had been building throughout the long hours of labor. She arrived at the Vaughn homestead carrying fresh bread and butter, expecting to offer the typical congratulations and assistance that followed any birth in their close-knit community. Instead, she found herself staring speechlessly at the infant in Emmeline's arms, her mouth hanging open in disbelief as she struggled to process what her eyes were showing her. "Dear Lord," she whispered, crossing herself reflexively. "Is that really a newborn baby?" Within the first hour after Magnus's birth, 3 more neighbors had gathered outside the cabin, drawn by Mrs. Hollister's stunned exclamations and the whispered rumors that something incredible, perhaps even impossible, had happened at the Vaughn place. Each new arrival reacted with the same sequence of emotions: disbelief, wonder, and a growing sense that they were witnessing something that would change their understanding of what was possible in their carefully ordered world. Doc Briggs attempted to maintain his scientific composure, but privately he was questioning fundamental principles he had accepted without doubt throughout his medical career. He measured the baby's length at 26 inches, examined his reflexes, and found them remarkably well developed for a newborn, and noted that Magnus seemed unusually alert and responsive to voices and movement. Every established medical fact he had learned suggested that such a birth was not just unusual, but genuinely impossible. Yet the evidence lay crying contentedly in his mother's massive arms, defying explanation, but undeniably real. As the morning progressed and more townspeople began arriving, first curious neighbors, then friends and acquaintances from farther settlements who had heard whispered rumors, Sheriff McKinley realized he was facing something unprecedented in his long career in law enforcement. Here was a situation that was completely legal, entirely natural, yet utterly unbelievable. More concerning was the expression he saw growing in people's eyes as they gazed at baby Magnus, not just wonder or amazement, but something deeper and more complicated, as if they were seeing something that would fundamentally alter their conception of human limitations. But what none of them could have anticipated was that among those early visitors was someone whose interest in Magnus went far beyond mere curiosity, and whose presence would soon transform their celebration into something far more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. By mid-morning, nearly 40 people had gathered around the Vaughn homestead, and their voices creating a constant murmur of amazement, speculation, and growing excitement. Word had spread through the community, with the speed that only truly extraordinary news could achieve, carried by writers who could barely contain their astonishment as they shared details that seemed too incredible to be true. "You have to see it to believe it," became the phrase repeated from cabin to cabin, drawing curious neighbors from farms and homesteads scattered across dozens of miles of rolling prairie. Ranchers abandoned their morning chores, women left bread rising in their ovens, and even the normally reserved town preacher hitched up his wagon to investigate claims that seemed to challenge the very order of creation. Sheriff McKinley found himself in the unusual position of managing crowd control, trying to balance the community's natural curiosity with the Vaughn family's need for privacy and rest. He established a system allowing small groups to enter the cabin briefly to pay their respects, while keeping the majority of visitors outside, where their conversations couldn't overwhelm the new mother and baby. Inside the cabin, Emmeline sat propped up in bed with Magnus nursing at her breast, and even this simple, natural act drew gasps of amazement from the women who came to offer traditional post-birth assistance. The baby's appetite was as extraordinary as his size, consuming what appeared to be enough milk to satisfy 2 or 3 typical infants. His suckling was strong and determined, and his grip on his mother's finger was powerful enough to surprise even Emmeline, whose own strength was legendary throughout the territory. Mrs. Patterson, who had assisted at dozens of births in the community and was considered an expert on infant behavior, shook her head in wonder as she watched the powerful way Magnus latched and fed. "I've never seen anything like it," she whispered to Mrs. Hollister, both women speaking in hushed tones as if they were witnessing something sacred. "Look at how alert his eyes are, how purposefully he moves. It's as if he's already weeks old, not hours." The baby's eyes were indeed remarkable, large, dark, and seemingly focused with an intensity that appeared far beyond typical newborn behavior. When people spoke, he would turn his head toward their voices. When faces moved within his field of vision, he would track their movement with apparent interest. Most unsettling of all, when adults looked directly at him, he seemed to return their gaze with an awareness that made many visitors deeply uncomfortable. Clayton found himself overwhelmed by the attention, simultaneously proud of his remarkable son, and increasingly anxious about what this newfound notoriety might mean for his family's future. Several men approached him with questions that made him distinctly uncomfortable, their inquiries carrying undertones that suggested they saw Magnus not as a beloved child, but as a phenomenon to be exploited. "Mac, how big do you reckon he'll grow, Clayton?" asked Tom Brennan, a rancher from the eastern edge of the territory, whose eyes held a calculating gleam. A boy that size might be worth his weight in gold to the right people. "What are you feeding that woman to make babies like that?" inquired another visitor, his tone suggesting that Emmeline's extraordinary pregnancy might be something that could be replicated and controlled. "Think he'll be strong enough to do a full man's work by age 10, speculated a third man, already seeming to plan Magnus's future without considering that he was still just hours old. The questions felt increasingly invasive and disturbing, as if people were already commodifying Magnus without regard for his humanity or his family's wishes. Clayton began to understand that their son's extraordinary nature might attract attention that went far beyond simple community curiosity. But it was the arrival of a well-dressed stranger on horseback that truly transformed the atmosphere from celebration to something far more ominous. The stranger introduced himself as Harrison Blake, a reporter from the territorial newspaper, who claimed to have received word of the unusual birth through the telegraph network that connected major settlements throughout the region. Blake carried a large camera and notebook, his eyes bright with the unmistakable gleam of a man who sensed a story that could establish his career and reputation. More troubling was Blake's companion, a man who remained mounted and silent, but whose sharp eyes seemed to catalog everything he observed with the methodical attention of someone gathering intelligence, rather than satisfying curiosity. Sheriff McKinley intercepted Blake before he could reach the cabin door, his instincts immediately alert to potential trouble. "Mr. Blake, I understand your professional interest, but this is a private family matter. The Vaughns deserve time to rest and bond with their new child." But Blake was persistent, his arguments crafted with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through persuasion or pressure. "Sheriff, if this baby is truly as remarkable as people are claiming, this could be significant far beyond your little community. Medical science might benefit tremendously from documenting this case. The public has a right to know about developments that could advance human understanding." His words carried an undertone that suggested the Vaughn family's privacy was less important than his professional ambitions, and his eyes held a calculating quality that made McKinley increasingly uncomfortable. Inside the cabin, Emmeline overheard portions of the conversation and felt a chill of apprehension that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. She pulled Magnus closer to her chest, protectively, suddenly understanding that their lives might never be private again. The realization that her son's extraordinary nature could attract attention from people whose motivations went far beyond simple curiosity filled her with a mother's primal fear for her child's safety. But what she couldn't have anticipated was that Blake's arrival was merely the beginning of their troubles, and that by evening, their quiet homestead would become the center of attention from forces whose interests in Magnus would prove far more dangerous and complex than simple journalistic curiosity. Unknown to the Vaughn family, one of their own neighbors had already been in secret communication with Blake for several hours, and the true test of their community's loyalty was about to begin. By evening, the situation had escalated far beyond anything anyone in the community had anticipated. Harrison Blake had not arrived alone, nor was his interest purely journalistic. 2 additional men had appeared claiming to represent scientific institutions from the eastern states, speaking in urgent, authoritative tones about the critical importance of documenting and studying Magnus for the advancement of medical knowledge and human understanding. Dr. Edmund Carlyle, a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to having his expertise respected without question, insisted he had traveled specifically from Boston to examine the infant. He carried official-looking documents and spoke with the confident authority of academic credentials. Professor Martin Ashworth claimed to represent a natural history society that collected information about unusual human specimens for scientific research. His manner was more aggressive than Carlyle's, and his questions carried disturbing implications about what kind of research he had in mind. Clayton stood on his porch, facing the growing crowd of strangers and townspeople, his jaw set with determination, but his eyes showing the strain of protecting his family from increasingly aggressive demands. The familiar faces of neighbors were now mixed with outsiders whose motivations were unclear and whose presence felt threatening. "Gentlemen," Clayton said, his voice carrying the firm authority of a man defending his home, "I appreciate your claimed interest in scientific advancement, but my son is 1 day old. He needs rest, his mother needs recovery time, and our family needs privacy." But Dr. Carlyle pressed forward his voice, carrying an authority that made several townspeople step back reflexively. "Mr. Vaughn, I don't think you fully comprehend the significance of what has occurred here. This child could represent an evolutionary leap forward, a glimpse into humanity's physical potential that we've never encountered before. To keep him hidden from scientific study would be a disservice not just to medical science, but to the future of human understanding itself." Professor Ashworth was more direct in his demands. "We're not asking for permanent custody, merely the opportunity to conduct thorough examinations, take detailed measurements, and document his development over time. Such a remarkable specimen shouldn't be wasted in frontier obscurity." The word specimen sent a chill through every parent in the crowd, and Sheriff McKinley positioned himself more deliberately between the visitors and the cabin door. His hand rested casually on his weapon belt in a gesture that was both subtle and unmistakably threatening. He had dealt with many types of men during his years as a lawman, and something about these particular strangers made his instincts prickle with warning signals. Their interest felt too calculated, too intense, as if they saw Magnus not as a human child deserving protection and love, but as a valuable research subject to be acquired and controlled. Inside the cabin, Emmeline listened to the heated discussion outside while holding Magnus close to her chest. The baby seemed unusually alert for his age, his large, bright eyes tracking movement and focusing on faces with an intensity that both amazed and unsettled her. When Doc Briggs approached to check on both mother and child, she gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Doc, these men outside are talking about my baby like he's some kind of laboratory animal. What do they really want, and what legal authority do they actually have?" Doc Briggs had been wondering the same thing throughout the long day. Dr. Carlyle had shown him credentials that appeared legitimate, but his questions had been deeply troubling. He had inquired about taking detailed body measurements, making plaster casts of Magnus's hands and feet, and most disturbing of all, he had made subtle suggestions about relocating the infant to a proper research facility, where he could be monitored and studied as he developed. "Mrs. Vaughn, legally they can't force anything without proper court orders and genuine medical justification. But they can make life very difficult if they choose to pursue this aggressively. People with credentials and institutional backing sometimes find ways to pressure families into compliance." As night fell over the homestead, the crowd of strangers showed no signs of dispersing. Several men had built small campfires and appeared to be settling in for an extended stay. Professor Ashworth had been observed speaking quietly with some of the local residents, and Clayton noticed money-changing hands, though he couldn't determine what arrangements were being negotiated. Most troubling of all was the behavior of Jacob Murphy, one of their closest neighbors, and a man Clayton had considered a trusted friend for over a decade. Murphy had been acting strangely throughout the day, avoiding eye contact with the family, speaking in hushed tones with the strangers, and seeming unusually interested in the layout of the cabin and the routines of the household. The atmosphere around the homestead felt charged with an energy that went far beyond mere curiosity or scientific interest. It was as if Magnus's birth had awakened something predatory and acquisitive in certain people, transforming what should have been a celebration into something that felt increasingly dangerous. As the baby stirred in his mother's arms and looked up at the gathered faces with those remarkably aware eyes, none of the family could have predicted that the most crucial test of their community's character was yet to come. By morning, they would all be forced to choose between protecting one extraordinary child and succumbing to pressures from forces whose true motivations were far more sinister than anyone had yet realized. The betrayal, when it came, would strike from the most unexpected direction, and the battle for Magnus's freedom would test every bond of loyalty and courage that held their frontier community together. The confrontation erupted at dawn, when Dr. Carlyle and Professor Ashworth arrived at the cabin door. With legal documents they claimed gave them authority to examine Magnus under territorial health regulations. Their confidence had grown overnight, bolstered by information that someone had clearly provided about the family's routines and the cabin's layout. Clayton barred their entry with his substantial frame, but Carlyle pushed forward with the assurance of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "Mr. Vaughn, this document requires your immediate compliance. We're no longer requesting permission, we're exercising legal authority." Sheriff McKinley stepped between them, his weathered face hard as granite, and his hand resting openly on his weapon. "I've read territorial law cover to cover, Doctor, and no document gives you the right to force entry into a private home to examine a healthy baby against the family's explicit wishes." But Carlyle produced another paper, this one bearing official seals that looked authentic, claiming that Magnus represented a potential public health concern requiring immediate investigation. Sheriff, this child's unusual size could indicate a contagious condition or environmental contamination that poses risks to the entire community. We have clear authority to quarantine the entire family if necessary to protect public safety. The threat sent a visible chill through the gathered townspeople, many of whom had children of their own, and understood the implications of such action. The possibility of quarantine could destroy the Vaughn family's livelihood and separate them from their community indefinitely. Mrs. Patterson, who had helped deliver half the babies in the county over 4 decades, stepped forward with the moral authority of long experience and community respect. "Doctor, I've witnessed every kind of birth complication and infant health issue in 40 years of midwifery, and there's absolutely nothing diseased or contagious about that baby. He's healthy, strong, nursing normally, and showing perfect reflexes. Your interest has nothing whatsoever to do with public health. It's about exploiting something remarkable for your own purposes." Her words carried weight with the community, but the strangers were undeterred. Professor Ashworth's mask of academic respectability was beginning to slip, revealing something more predatory underneath. These frontier people don't understand the value of what they're protecting. That child represents research opportunities worth thousands of dollars to the right institutions. It was then that the true betrayal revealed itself. Jacob Murphy stepped out from behind the strangers, his face flushed with shame, but his eyes hard with determination. In his hands were detailed drawings of the cabin's interior, sketches of the family's daily routines, and notes about Magnus's feeding schedule and sleeping patterns. "I'm sorry, Clayton," Murphy said, though his voice carried no genuine remorse. "But they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. $500 just for information and another $1,000 if I help them take the baby safely. My family needs that money more than your family needs to keep that freak child." The word freak hit Clayton like a physical blow, but it was Emmeline's response that truly shocked everyone present. She rose from the bed with Magnus in her arms, her full 6 feet 7 inch height, making her an imposing figure even in her nightgown. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet menace that made every person present understand why she had never needed anyone's protection. "Jacob, you've been in my home, shared my table, and called yourself friend to my family for 10 years. And you would sell my newborn son to strangers for money." Murphy's shame was evident, but his desperation was stronger. "Emmeline, you don't understand. My crops failed, my cattle are dying, and my wife is sick. That money could save my family. Your baby's going to be famous anyway, at least this way someone profits from it." The confrontation might have escalated into violence, but at that moment, more than 30 neighbors emerged from concealment around the property where they had been positioned throughout the night. Leading them was old Thomas Henley, the most respected man in the community, carrying a shotgun across his arms in a gesture that was both casual and unmistakably threatening. "Doctors," Henley said in the calm, measured tone he used for settling the most serious disputes, "seems to me you've seen what you came to see. The baby's healthy, the family's well, and there's nothing here that requires your continued attention or intervention." But Professor Ashworth made the critical error of threatening to return with territorial marshals and federal authority to enforce their claimed rights. The response from the community was immediate and unified. Every man present stepped closer to the Vaughn family, creating a human wall between Magnus and the persistent strangers. Sheriff McKinley's voice carried absolute finality when he addressed the would-be kidnappers. "Gentlemen, you have exactly 5 minutes to pack your equipment and leave this property. After that, you'll be trespassing on private land, and these folks take their property rights very seriously indeed." But the most decisive moment was yet to come, and it would take Emmeline Vaughn's own extraordinary strength to end the threat to her family once and for all, while revealing the true character of the man who had been willing to betray them for money. Dr. Carlyle made the fatal error of lunging forward in a desperate attempt to seize Magnus from Emmeline's arms, apparently believing he could intimidate a woman who had just given birth. What he encountered instead was 6 feet 7 inches of maternal fury, backed by muscles that could split firewood and lift grown calves without assistance. Emmeline's free hand shot out with lightning speed and seized Carlyle by the throat, lifting him completely off the ground, with such ease that the gathered crowd gasped in amazement. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a quiet menace that made every person present understand exactly why she had never needed anyone's protection throughout her life. "Doctor, you will never touch my son. You will never return to my home. And if I see you anywhere near my family again, I will break every bone in your body with my bare hands, starting with the small ones and working my way up to the large ones very, very slowly." She held him suspended for several more seconds, his feet dangling inches from the porch floor, before setting him down with a gentleness that somehow made the threat even more terrifying. Carlyle stumbled backward, his face pale, and his previous confidence completely shattered. Professor Ashworth, witnessing his colleague's humiliation and the unwavering hostility of the entire community, began gathering their equipment with nervous haste. "This isn't over," he stammered, but his words carried no conviction whatsoever. Sheriff McKinley stepped forward and spoke with quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Yes, it is over. You have no legal standing here, no medical emergency to justify your presence, and no welcome from this community. Leave now, and don't test whether these folks' hospitality has any limits." But it was Jacob Murphy who faced the community's true judgment. As the strangers loaded their wagon and prepared to depart in defeat, the neighbors who had known Murphy for years gathered around him with expressions of disgust and betrayal. "Jacob," said Thomas Henley, his voice heavy with disappointment, "you've shown us who you really are when money was involved. Pack your things and take your family somewhere else. You're no longer welcome in this community." The sentence of exile was delivered with the quiet finality that frontier justice demanded. Murphy's face crumpled as he realized that his betrayal had cost him far more than he could ever have gained. $500 meant nothing compared to losing the trust and support of the only community his family had ever known. As the sun climbed higher and the defeated strangers disappeared over the horizon, Clayton approached them with Magnus in his arms, the baby alert and seemingly unfazed by the morning's drama. "Gentlemen, take one last look. This is my son, healthy and happy in his family's care, surrounded by people who love him. Whatever you thought you could learn from him by force, he'll learn far better by growing up free among people who see him as a precious child rather than a research subject." The departure of Carlyle Ashworth and the disgraced Murphy seemed to lift an oppressive weight from the entire community. People who had been tense and worried throughout the night began to smile and speak normally again, as if a dark storm cloud had finally passed over and moved on to threaten someone else. Doc Briggs approached Emmeline and conducted one final examination of both mother and child, declaring them both in perfect health and requiring no further outside intervention or concern. "Mrs. Vaughn, your boy is remarkable, but he's remarkable in the way that all healthy, loved children are remarkable. He doesn't need scientists or institutions to tell us his value. It's written in his parents' eyes and his community's protection." By midday, most of the crisis-driven visitors had departed, leaving the Vaughn family with their closest neighbors and genuine friends. Mrs. Patterson organized the women to bring food and help with household chores, while the men quietly discussed methods for ensuring that no other unwelcome visitors would disturb the family's peace in the future. Magnus nursed contentedly in his mother's arms, seemingly unaware that he had been the center of such intense attention and conflict. His remarkable size was already becoming simply part of who he was, rather than a curiosity to be exploited. Cordelia Whitman, gathering her midwife's supplies before departing for her own home, paused to look at the baby one final time. "Emmeline, in all my years of bringing children into this world, I've never encountered anything quite like Magnus. But more than his extraordinary size, what strikes me most powerfully is how perfectly he belongs with your family and in this community. Sometimes nature creates something special, and the best thing we can do is simply provide love and protection while letting it grow naturally. As the sun set over the Vaughn homestead 3 days after Magnus's birth, Clayton sat on the porch with Emmeline, watching their remarkable son sleep peacefully between them. The baby had been weighed one final time at exactly 22 pounds, 4 ounces, a figure that would eventually be recorded in medical journals and territorial records, but would never define who he would become as a person. Sheriff McKinley had assured them that no legal challenges to their custody existed, and that the community's protection would ensure their privacy was respected going forward. Word had been sent to territorial authorities documenting the attempted exploitation and the community's united response, establishing legal precedent for protecting extraordinary children from those who would exploit them. Magnus Vaughn had entered the world as a physically remarkable baby, but more importantly, he had been welcomed into a family and community that valued his humanity far above his uniqueness. His extraordinary size would always be part of his story, but it would be just one chapter in a life defined by love, protection, and the freedom to grow into whoever he was meant to become. As his parents watched him sleep, they knew that whatever challenges his unusual size might present in the years ahead, he would face them surrounded by people who saw him first and foremost as a beloved child, and only secondarily as a remarkable phenomenon. The community that had protected him in his first days would continue to nurture and defend him as he grew, ensuring that his extraordinary gifts would be used for good rather than exploited by those who valued profit over human dignity. The prairie wind whispered through the grass around their homestead, carrying the sounds of a community at peace with itself and confident in its values. Magnus stirred slightly in his sleep, but remained peaceful, surrounded by the love and protection that would define his extraordinary life. In the distance, coyotes began their evening songs, welcoming another soul into the vast, wild territory where anything seemed possible, and where the bonds of family and community proved stronger than any force that tried to break them.